start as media is still joining. Good morning, good afternoon to some. Welcome to today's Ethnic Media Services Zoom News Conference. I'm Pilar Marrero at Ethnic Media Services, your moderator for today. Today's briefing focuses on Trump's immigration plan, how it could change America forever. During his first administration, Donald Trump attempted major changes to the immigration system, separated families at the border, imposed a Muslim ban, quote unquote, canceled TPS for Hondurans and DACA for Dreamers, and threw administrative wrenches on legal immigration and the asylum system. Most of these actions were undone by the Biden administration. This time around, if Trump is elected, his camp has a much more ambitious plan. Massive deportations and detention camps, freezes of legal immigration categories, punishing citizens and legal residents if they study or live with undocumented people, and a team in the wings waiting to implement these radical reforms. We will hear from a team of experts who will analyze the plan, detailed in a document hundreds of pages long by the Heritage Foundation, the right-wing think tank, and its potential effects on Americans, immigrants, and the economy. So with that, we welcome our panel, and they are Cecilia Esterline, Immigration Research Analyst at the Niskanen Center, David J. Beyer, who's been with us before, Director of Immigration Studies at Cato Institute, and Zachary Mueller, Senior Research Director for America's Voice Education Fund. Please remember to speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. And for you reporters, please remember, ask questions in the chat. It's very important to have a good discussion. So Cecilia, I'm going to invite you to take the stage now. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all for the invitation. I'll go ahead and get started and talk about this report that she was mentioning. The Heritage Foundation has published regular iterations of their mandate for leadership, as they call it, which is their vision for the next conservative administration for over 40 years now. And the most recent iteration of it is called what they've named it Project 2025. And it includes detailed policy reforms across all agencies and all levels of the federal government. And in February, I published a report which pulled out the immigration changes that they proposed in this plan. And it's more than 175 changes to immigration policy. And despite having the backing of several prominent members of former President Trump's first administration, the plan ultimately does not reflect what the American public wants to see in a secure, controlled, and effective immigration system. They appeal to a very narrow group of people whose political goals ignore the consequences of the plan's implications for small businesses and American citizens, and risk the balance of power between states and the federal government, and ultimately the security of our nation. So even though these policies have narrow support, they should be taken seriously. Former President Trump implemented nearly 64% of the prior mandate for leadership's recommendations just within the first year of his administration. So the threat of these policies being the foundation for a potential second term is very real. And so, as I said, there's over 175 policies, but I'm going to just detail a few for you here. And it's important to note that these policies really abandon traditional conservative values like supporting business growth and development, decentralizing power away from the federal government, and decreasing bureaucratic hurdles. In fact, often these do the opposite. So one thing that they hope to do is, without Congress using their executive authority, create across-the-board impediments to a functioning legal immigration system, introducing processing delays and other administrative hurdles. For instance, the H-2A and H-2B visas, these are critical, temporary, seasonal visas that sustain the agricultural industry, construction, forestry, landscaping, and hospitality. However, every year, the federal government publishes a list of available and eligible countries that are able to utilize these visas. They do this based on compliance and risk metrics, in order to maintain the security and integrity of the program. And Project 2025 argues that under the next conservative administration, no updates should be issued, which would essentially grind the program to a halt, except in very limited exceptional circumstances, which would be a devastating blow to the industries that rely on these visas. They also create new arbitrary standards that would cut off the intake of entire categories of immigration. Any category deemed to have an excessive backlog, for instance, would be shut off from receiving new applications and petitions. However, excessive is neither defined nor clarified, and given the number of applications that are currently in queue for evaluation at the USCIS, which is the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, this could be very problematic for individuals who are currently renewal of status and for the businesses hoping to join this line and bring in the labor that they need. They also would create new procedural impediments that could create additional backlogs that would trigger the cutoff. For instance, they would require every approval to be processed through a secondary office, one that currently completes around 35,000 cases per year, compared to USCIS, which completed 8.6 million cases in 2022. If every case is funneled through the secondary review process, it would trigger additional delays and backlogs that would ultimately end up cutting off the categories completely. And once again, this is not only detrimental to individuals and businesses seeking their initial approval of a visa, but it would also have devastating consequences for individuals who are already here, for the businesses they support, for the jobs they fill, and their ability to remain in the United States while they await their renewal. The plan would also disrupt the balance of power between states and the federal government, beyond imposing standards of mandatory information sharing between the states and federal government, which I'm sure the other panelists will likely share about. Project 2025 also intends to use funding to bully states and localities into compliance with political priorities of the administration. For instance, federal financial aid for students. Only green card holders and U.S. citizens are eligible for federal financial aid in the United States. However, in-state tuition criteria is determined on a state-by-state basis, each state requiring various lengths of residence because this is an authority of the states. This means that 26 states plus DC have chosen to permit DACA recipients to qualify for in-state tuition. 23 states plus DC have also chosen to permit other categories of undocumented immigrants to do so, again, if they meet the minimum residency length requirements. However, in an attempt to force states to change these policies, Project 2025 directs the Department of Education to deny loan access to students, including U.S. citizens, at schools that provide in-state tuition to, as they say, illegal aliens, which the authors have already defined as including DACA recipients. So in total, there are nearly 10.7 million American students who are enrolled in higher education in states that allow these so-called illegal aliens to access in-state tuition. Therefore, if enacted, up to 67% of American college and graduate level students could lose access to federal financial aid if enrolled at a university that offers in-state tuition to undocumented or DACA students. So while this would be a devastating blow to Americans' educational access, it is more likely that states and universities would be forced to revise their laws in order to maintain the U.S. citizen students' access to critical financial aid. And this would allow the administration to weaponize funding for their political gain. And these are just maybe the tip of the iceberg of some of the policies that are described in the report and in the mandate. And so some of the many devastating implications of the plan, but I will stop here and I'm happy to answer any initial questions that you all may have.
Okay, thank you, Cecilia. We have a question from Henrietta. Henrietta, please go ahead with your question.
Thanks, Pilar. It would seem if Trump's plan is so detrimental to business, then wouldn't it, wouldn't one conclude that businesses' opposition to it would make it difficult to implement? And the last thing one would think Trump would want to do is to alienate business. So wouldn't this, in a way, doom his plan?
I think you're right that it's part of this is that the business community is going to be opposed to a lot of these changes. The H-2A and H-2B have great support, and that's just one example of a visa that is used widely by employers in the United States, not to mention the many other plans. And in reality, these impediments would also affect American families who are trying to get loved ones here. So across the board, these would be very with the business community. I think, however, the reality is that these policies do only appeal to a very narrow subset of individuals that are going to be part of the cabinet if he is able to, or likely to be part of the cabinet if he's able to secure a second term. And he has the authority to do these things without congressional involvement and often without, he may open a notice of public rulemaking, potential rulemaking, but some of them would not even be open to public comment.
Cecilia, you talked about the legal immigration categories. We know there's family categories and there's, work-based categories of immigration. What you're saying is that, and what the report says, is that they will do things to kind of paralyze the system so people cannot continue to apply. What would be the practical implication of this?
Yeah, so in reality, there's a lot of people in the United States currently, millions, who are on a type of temporary visa. And often, in order to remain in the United States and without accruing unlawful presence, they often have to apply before the expiration of their status in order to apply for an extension, and that allows them to stay while USCIS is processing it. And so this is for those who are already within the United States. This is problematic if they're not able to send their application because USCIS has said, we have enough, we can't accept anymore. This will be problematic. Those individuals would have to leave, and all of the businesses where they work, whether they're here on a work visa or another type of temporary visa, they would be forced to leave. Alternatively, individuals who are coming to the United States would not be able to apply if a category is capped and cut off. Meaning that businesses that need them for seasonal jobs might not even be able to send in the application, or a temporary job of kinds. So there's all kinds of levels of this, and across the board, cutting off categories based on arbitrary standards, not congressionally authorized standards of caps, but sticking to the congressionally authorized caps, but cutting them off based on administrative hurdles kind of bypasses congressional intent and allows them to cut off these categories entirely. And so individuals cannot come or join their families, or would lose the ability to extend their status here in the United States.
Can you tell us a little bit about the architects of these proposals? I know it's the Heritage Foundation, and who are they and who else is involved?
Yeah, so the Heritage Foundation is the author of this report, and they are the ones who have authored a similar report for decades. And like I said, it has the backing of the first administration, 64% of the recommendations in the first year, and that's let alone the other 3 years of his administration. So it is a report that should be taken seriously. However, the chapters, there's a chapter that's also written by Ken Cuccinelli, who was President Trump's head of immigration. And so this is really important for us to take in mind the people who are behind it and the people who are likely to be the forces in charge of these policies under his new, if he is, able to get a second administration as well, then these people are likely to be involved in that. And I think that goes to show that this is much deeper than maybe his surface level rallying calls and things like this that he may say at a rally, but the people who are really behind these policies are likely to be involved in the implementation of them in a second term.
Okay, there's a question in the chat by Orhan. Orhan, you want to ask your question before we move on to the second speaker?
Yes. So thank you for explanation. This is really good details to hear. So I'm just curious, do you have any study who approved this policies, and what is the percentage of American approved that kind of policies?
So I haven't done the polling myself, but I am happy to share polling. I have to just pull it up. However, and so I can share it in the chat in just a moment. However, recently I know that the Americans for Progress did a type of polling like this across the board, and Economic Innovation Group also did polling across the board. And the reality is that the majority of Americans do support. Specifically, the border is something that where, opinions may diverge based on your political affiliation. However, across the board, there are types of immigration that really rally all groups of Americans, all voters, regardless of political affiliation, that really have widespread support. And so I'm happy to share that polling in the group in just a moment.
Thank you, Cecilia. And if you can share a link to the study, that would be great.
Yeah, I will do.
Awesome. Please stay around and answer questions if you can in the chat, or make comments, whatever you like to do, and we'll come back to all the speakers at the end. Thank you, Cecilia.
Great, thank you.
And now we go to David Beer.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the invitation to talk about this topic. Look, a lot of the things that the Trump administration is going to do in a new term in office are quite predictable based on the things they did the last time around. Almost all of those proposals are going to come back and be re-implemented in some form. These include the Muslim ban, security ban, whatever you want to call it, which would be applied to a much larger group of countries and probably would be less focused on Muslim countries in particular this time around. I would certainly expect to see Venezuela added to the list of countries where we can't vouch for their vetting or whatever the excuse is. And so even for Venezuelans who have been living in Colombia peacefully for many years or other countries, they would still be subject to the same style of security ban that we saw for many Middle Eastern and African countries in, under the first administration. Of course, the easiest category of immigration to target for the president would be the refugee program, which we saw the last time, gutted under the Trump administration, reduced by about 90% from what it was under the Obama administration. We would see that at least this time, perhaps even further. This time around, the president sets the cap, so he can set the cap at 0 if he wants. I don't expect it quite to be 0, but we saw the smallest caps in history, and ultimately in his final term in office, or his final year in office, it was less than 10,000. We're projecting that this calendar year we were going to have over 100,000 refugees admitted by the Biden administration. So certainly going to see dramatic reductions in refugees. All of the Biden administration executive actions that have made legal migration easier, all of these are going to be rescinded almost immediately. The parole authority is going to be greatly restricted. So Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans who are coming in under parole sponsorship, 30,000 per month for the last couple of years, all of that is going to go away almost immediately. And you also have the CBP-1 app, which is letting in 1,500 or so per day at the southwest border. that process for applying for lawful entry at the southwest border is discretionary, and the administration would likely remove that immediately upon coming into office. And so those two processes, which have relieved pressure on people coming illegally, fewer people are coming illegally from those countries, and as a result of the app's availability at the border for all nationalities, that's going to be a major change and potentially result in more people coming illegally in the long term. I certainly expect a lot of people will plan their trip to arrive before the Trump administration comes into office. So we'll see the spike in the same drop that we saw in 2017. But in the long term, we know that these patterns, these migration patterns, are not controlled by who's in office. It's controlled by economic and security necessities of the individuals who are traveling, and the availability of jobs and opportunity here in the United States. That's not likely to change. We could always see a recession. We could see a major change there, but I expect that you're going to see the big decline day one after he comes into office, like we did last time. But every day, essentially, since after January of 2017 through 2019, was almost a continuous increase in illegal immigration. I expect once you have the people adjust and recognize, okay, this is the new reality, this is how I'm going to have to go, we'll see the same adjustment that we saw under the Trump administration, where he left office with, at the time, the highest number of arrests by Border Patrol since for any December, going all the way back to December of 1999. He doesn't like to talk about that part of his record. He likes to focus on April of 2020, when the world was shut down and there weren't any jobs for people to go to. But December 2020 is a better reflection of his record. And the reaction that we're going to see to those higher border numbers that will play out if he's elected 2026, 2027, that's where you're going to see big changes in enforcement in the United States. Unlike the style of enforcement that we saw in the first term, he tried to remove prioritization and do these different things to make it easier to remove people. And there were some more removals, mainly generated by the increasing amount of detention that Congress had funded. So he increased the number of immigrants held in detention by about 20,000 to its peak in 2019. And so that allowed them to remove more people, but was not even close to being sufficient. Basically, our analysis is every additional increase in detention, one bed, translated to about 1.5 additional removals. So 20,000 additional beds led to something like 50,000, 60,000 additional removals per year. And that is not anywhere close to the scale, obviously, of what they've been talking about with millions of removals and all of that. And that's where their plans to bring in the military, have detention camps in the United States, all of this stuff, flagrantly unconstitutional, illegal. Look, even under the Trump administration, the first time around, they tried to hold people at the border in conditions that were unconstitutional. And by that, I mean, you cannot hold people in conditions where they do not have a place to sleep, where there is not sanitation, where there are not these basic human conditions cared for, medical care provided. And obviously you need security. So it's not enough to just have, a place for people. You need them to be secure. protected from each other as well as preventing them from leaving. Obviously, there's nowhere close to the number of detention beds that they would need to carry this out, even if they got back to the 50,000 number they had previously, not anywhere close to doing what they want to do. And there are legal and constitutional obstacles to ramping that up dramatically. If you look at all of the prisons in the entire United States, you're only getting to 1.5 million or so detention beds, and obviously we're not emptying our prisons in order to accommodate President Trump's plan. So I think there are a lot of logistical obstacles to him carrying out the plan, legal obstacles as well. But I think you're going to see an unprecedented reaction by this administration when they realize that a lot of the causes of migration are not the Biden administration and just President Biden's presence in office. And when he goes out and Trump comes in, it'll go down, he'll declare victory, but that will be a short-lived victory again. And that's when you're really going to see a lot of these plans that are being discussed and kind of radical plans be brought out as this is going to be the solution. And, I think there is concerns about him ignoring the Constitution, ignoring court decisions, potentially authorizing legal use, legalizing the use of deadly force at the border. These types of things openly discussed in Republican circles now, but they're illegal, they're unconstitutional, and the only question is whether there's anyone who can stop this president from, any president really, but the next president from violating the Constitution in these ways. Thank you.
David, what does the report say about the way they plan to deport people or round up people for deportation?
Right, so they want to use the state and local authorities as a force multiplier because there aren't enough ICE agents to do this. Certainly, they're going to have some eager partners in this in some areas, but not where most of the immigrants are. So there's going to be incredible pushback at that level. They want to coerce these sanctuary cities into doing what the federal government wants by withholding funds. And so that's going to be a big part of the agenda is trying to enforce or force these localities to come on board and help them. They also, of course, want to use the military directly to engage in this type of arresting and incarcerating people. Again, this is not going to work. You cannot use the military for civilian law enforcement. They already have Ken Cuccinelli out there arguing that the Posse Comitatus Act does not actually stop the military from being used for immigration enforcement. So they are sort of teasing this up. It's illegal. Their interpretation would not hold up in court, but I do think they're likely to try it. And so you're going to try a lot of things and see what sticks, and some of it is and some of it isn't. But that's a big part of their agenda for sure, is using the Defense Department both directly through the military as well as through the use of the Defense Department funds in order to effectuate a lot of these changes.
David, when you talk about illegal, what comes to mind is the Supreme Court and the way the Supreme Court is right now, with Supreme Court justices that are allegedly engaged in corruption and political influence. Seems to me we are set up for a lot of illegal stuff, potentially, that becomes legal. Do you think about that?
It's certainly a concern of mine. It takes a backbone from the courts to stand up to a president. in particular one who's threatening to violate orders from courts. And that really, you know, if once you go down that road, then all of a sudden, you know, the Supreme Court is on the verge of becoming irrelevant. So it is a huge threat. It's something that should keep us all up at night, wondering about. The reality is, with some very narrow exceptions, the first Trump administration did follow orders that went against them on immigration, and it did happen on multiple major cases, DACA being probably the prime example, but many cases where they lost in lower courts, appeals courts, and even the Supreme Court, where, you know, they didn't get the decisions that they were going for. So I am hopeful that there is backbone in the courts to stand up to an administration that says, you know, we are the law and what we want is legal by definition. So I am hopeful on that front. I think we've seen examples in the last 4 years of cases coming to the courts where the Trump team has been defending itself, and the courts haven't always sided with the former president. So I'm not totally pessimistic, but it's certainly a concern that I have, and probably the biggest concern in terms of a second term for this the former president.
David, is birthright citizenship also part of this plan? Taking it
Yes,
away?
absolutely. He, again, you know, he teased this last time, and even during his administration talked about it. It is one of those things where I really don't see the courts going along with an elimination by executive order of birthright citizenship. There's really not a good legal case here, given what the statute says, what the Constitution says, given, you know, obviously we have more than a century of law and precedent built up around birthright citizenship being a thing for anyone who has a child in the United States. So this is one of many things that he might try to throw against the wall. I'm not sure if that's going to be the main priority, just because he's trying to remove a lot of people, and if you throw even more people into that bucket, it hasn't deterred him before. He certainly, has been a chaos agent on immigration and citizenship, but that's one where I'm quite confident in the courts, and I'm less confident in their commitment to it based on what they did last time and based on the scale of what they're going to be dealing with. I mean, the immigration system, the immigration courts are so incredibly backlogged. The rate of migration at the border is going to be high at points during their term in office. So they're going to have a lot to deal with. And so I'm less confident they're going to prioritize that, but it is part of their plans, and we could see action on that.
Thank you, David. Please stick around. There's a few questions for you in the chat. If you can just drop a line or two. We're going to move ahead, and if you can respond in the chat, that would be great. And then we'll come back around. Thank you,
Okay.
David. All right, Zach. Welcome, Zach Mueller from America's Voice. There are many things that you have for us, I'm sure, but there are a couple of questions in the chat that indicate why it is important to take a look at why we think the way we think about immigration and why we have the wrong ideas about things that are happening. So talk to us about, your specialty, disinformation, and what's driving all of this.
Yeah, so glad to be joined by some other esteemed folks here. And so really what I want to focus a little bit from my remarks here today is really a bit about the kind of broader political implications and the themes that we're seeing. So, really what we see is Trump's immigration agenda presents three interrelated threats in the form of mass deportation, political violence, and a threat to American democracy. And today, I just want to expand a little bit on each of these core themes, on the issue that Trump and the GOP are making a cornerstone of their 2024 electoral campaign, and its acute threat of this agenda for the American people. So there are two components of Trump's agenda that we see. So it's the detailed administrative plans being cooked up by his allies around the Project 2025, kind of embodied in the Project 2025. And then there is what Trump and the man himself campaigns on, the promises he makes at his rallies and in media appearances. And I don't think either one of these is mutually exclusive, but are kind of function in conversation to help move the extreme positions on immigration further, where the law really becomes a challenge to overcome and not really an impediment to rein in their vision. So I think this dynamic is key to understanding Trump and immigration and the immigration agenda. So, and I think it's found, quickly becoming as part of the signature promise of the Trump campaign, which is mass deportation. Now, they're, as you already heard today, they're actively campaigning on calls to round up, detain, and deport 15 to 30 million people, directed by a red state National Guard troops to march into neighboring blue states, deputizing local police while granting them immunity from prosecution, and deploying full-scale military operation on U.S. soil just for the sheer manpower to carry out the feat that they are promising. So obviously the numbers of 15 to 30 million are wildly inaccurate to the size of the undocumented population. But I think they're important to highlight, just as they're like indicative of the unqualified, indiscriminate and the zeal of which they will adopt the pursuit of our immigrant neighbors if they are given the chance. So one of a key ally of Trump, Tom Homan, has repeatedly said, quote, everyone is on the table. And I think we should take them seriously at their word, which means, as been mentioned, right, they're going to go after dreamers, TPS holders, and the 80% of the undocumented population who have called the United States home since 2010. As Trump has made explicit, they are not just going to go after new arrivals or the, quote, bad ones, but, a second grade teacher with DACA, home health care aide with TPS, and farm workers keeping food in the grocery store and inflation down. So, and I think in just 12 short years, the extreme agenda adopted by the mainstream right has shifted from, self-deportation to mass deportation, despite the cruelty embodied in the kind of the former becoming emblematic of the party that has been unable to pull together a popular vote victory in 2 decades. The one-time reform champions like Senator Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio, who a decade prior were talking about a pathway to citizenship in the hopes of charting a new path forward, are now enthusiastically adopting white nationalist talking points as they champion mass deportation, as they hope, what they once hoped were their fellow Americans. And I think the havoc wrought by this plan will not be contained to those who lack legal status. I think one estimate has found that over 4.4 million U.S. citizen children could be affected if this plan is to go into full effect. Moreover, I think the history of the Eisenhower program, which Trump proudly says he's going to top, saw many U.S. citizens kind of ensnared in that mass deportation operation. And so I think it's important that we're not hopelessly naive, that under the direction of Donald Trump, this isn't folks will only be targeted because of their immigration status, but I think we're also going to see folks not fitting the look of, quote, real Americans, straight out of central casting, won't become the targets of massive harassment under this scheme. And I think, while Trump might be shaky on the specifics of the details of his plan, I think it's important that we think about those around Project 2025, others like Stephen Miller, and Ken Cuccinelli and others who have detailed proposals to be able to carry out some of these positions. And what we've seen is, and what we're concerned about is that folks like Miller, Cuccinelli, and many others are going to suggest policies to overcome pesky legal laws on the books about deploying the military, whether that be around the Insurrection Act or just simply asserting the white nationalist conspiracy that immigrants constitute a literal military invasion to grant themselves and red state governors war powers, of which they are already arguing. I think this brings us to a little bit to the second theme, which is the use of the white nationalist replacement and invasion conspiracy that we've seen across the board. And this is despite this increasing the threat of domestic terrorism that the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security has repeatedly warned that the language of invasion and replacement have now become the mainstream of the immigration talking points from Republicans on this cycle. So, this, as a reminder, was shoved into the public consciousness around the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, where folks were talking about Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us, taking the ideas of the eugenics movement from a century earlier, the ideas of Madison Grant and the passing of the Great Race, which Hitler later described as his Bible, are now in a disturbing rhyme of history where Trump is promising to become a dictator, echoing rhetoric of poisoning the blood and other calls to that are threatening our democracy itself. So Trump and Republicans, I think, are importantly here in lockstep behind him, creating a backup plan if the immigrant demagoguery fails to deliver them the Electoral College victory in November. So another violent assault to overturn the democracy by laying the foundation for their supporters to believe that the election was rigged. And the beating heart of this scheme is the replacement theory lie that immigrants are the villains polluting our ballot box with fraudulent votes. And this is one of the main vehicles driving this bigoted and anti-democratic conspiracy, is hid behind the fig leaf of the baseless myth that there's a threat of non-citizen voting. So I think we should think about this as also connected to the Project 2025. There's a spin-off organization called Only Citizens Can Vote, made up another 70 plus organizations, many of them tied to Project 2025, that is led by Cleta Mitchell and Stephen Miller and many others who have been pushing this idea that there is a threat of non-citizen voting in our federal elections, really setting up the idea that it's in November, either they win or you cheated, is their mantra. So in sum total, the promises and proposals isn't just limited to a conversation about how to handle immigration, to manage global migration flows, but a white nationalist vision that seeks to remake who gets to be American while simultaneously using the rhetoric to lay the groundwork for another violent assault on democracy. And I think it's important for us to keep kind of these threats in mind as we move forward, that it's not just about the individual policies or the immigrant community alone, but this is a much broader concern that is being put forward, and where immigrants and the calls for their deportation and their descriptions and their dehumanization is leading to some other serious concerns for the American democracy and our public safety. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Zach. Okay, so we know that all over the world, global migrants have become scapegoats, which is so European elections where the right wing gained gained quite a bit in some countries. This is driven by anti-immigrant hate. Do you feel that do you feel that this is what's driving the immigration plan that the Heritage Foundation is putting forth? And do you see Europe being infected by this virus coming from Trump as well?
Yeah, I think two things can be true. One, I think there is a sentiment of nativism and xenophobia that is driving some part of this, a rejection of the foreign non-white other, and fears of that the white America that they believe is under threat from immigrants. But I also think it's important to realize that this is not just about hate towards immigrants, but it is a political vehicle to drive their agenda forward, to use coded rhetoric around and dog whistles around immigrants to racialize fears of and anxieties that people have around economic security in their own lives, around the personal and community safety that they feel, and their sense of identity, which are all very real concerns that many of us share. But what I see in a lot of the politicized versions of the rhetoric and the anti-immigrant demagoguery is to be able to racialize those concerns and to move that as a political issue. I think we see that in the United States. I think it's an export into the European context, and there is a conversation that's happening there. And so I think it's important that we kind of name that both there is that version there, but there's another part of the agenda as well. And I do think that there are those around that are in Project 2025, like Stephen Miller's organization, who have long been true believers in the belief that America should not be a place of immigration, to reimagine what the United States is and divorce it from our long storied history of being a place of immigration that has been our strength for centuries now. And I think that is what's different about this time, that I think we've seen, Trump run before, but I think the threat is much more acute this time around.
Finally, I wanted to ask you about media, the role of media. I was looking at Fox News the other day, and there were 3 different types of stories going on a loop. One was about the border and about how they identified some terrorists, like 8 terrorists, people with terrorist links or something like that. I wasn't hearing it. I was just looking at it. Somebody was looking at Fox next to me. The other thing was Hunter Biden, and the third thing, can't remember what it was, but it was something similar. They're talking about the border nonstop. They're talking about the border as a threat. And they're talking about, the third thing was the economy under Biden, whatever, the high prices under Biden, et cetera. There's a lot of polarization in our media as well. And there are media such as Fox News and others, and social media it's an example. I've been seeing a lot of disinformation on social media just in the last week. We can only expect this to increase, and we can only expect this to kind of color what we see as the main problem and how we see immigration in this context. What's your take on what's going on now?
Yeah,
what can happen in the next few months?
Yeah, so what we've been tracking is that we've already seen $190 million on TV ads and CTV ads just this year alone from Republican candidates using anti-immigrant rhetoric or negative anti-immigrant messaging in their campaigns, which is a dramatic increase from even 2022 and in 2020, that we're seeing that this is an increased focus for right-wing media outlets, as well as the Republican campaign and some more of the more movement organizational types like we see around Project 2025. So I think there is a bit of a collaborative, if not coordinated effort to continue to elevate mis and disinformation about immigration as a political vehicle in this election cycle. So we're going to continue to see stories that are being taken out of context. Like you mentioned, the story of the recent sting operation that saw the arrest of 8 individuals. And what we see is that we can think about lots of different things around that, but I think there's an indication that, well, that's law enforcement doing its job as they are set out currently to do, which is to identify when there might be threats and to investigate those threats. And so I think that's important for us to keep in mind. But we are going to see lots and lots and lots of fear-mongering that exists there. But I think to your other point is that it's not just about the border. And I think we're seeing something different, is that in what folks are talking about by 2025, what is being at Donald Trump's rallies, at every single one of his rallies and media appearances, they are talking about interior enforcement. They are not having active qualifiers to deport dreamers, to TPS holders, to folks who have lived in the United States. As the DHS report put the analysis of 80% of whom have lived in the United States for over a decade. And I think the economic consequences of that are massive. I think the social consequences of that are massive. And I think that's actually something that's different and new that I think is really important, that this is not just about new arrivals. And what they're talking about is long established members of the community, that there were, up until recently, vocal members of the Republican Party that were embracing a different path forward on that. And I think there is lots of conversation to be had, that there are some Republicans, maybe they disagree, but they might have been quiet. And so I think there is room to be asking those questions if they too, like Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio, also support signing up for the mass deportation in the millions. Whether they're able to execute that plan or not, right, I think as David laid out, right, there are lots of challenges to move forward on moving that on the actual ability to execute, but that is what they are promising their supporters. And I think it's really clear for us it's a moment to try to get clarity on those that are running for office on where they stand on this key platform of the party at the moment.
Okay, we have a few minutes, and I want to go around the panel again, turning the table to the Democrats, to the Biden administration. So we know what Trump's going to do. The Biden administration has done a lot of things that he's not getting credit for, but also maybe he hasn't done enough, and he has sort of played into the hands of the restrictive immigration, the people who want to restrict immigration without any consideration whatsoever. In the last, for example, the last order he gave on the asylum process. But how can we judge what a Biden administration, second administration, could be on immigration? Do we expect good things? Or do we have the environment to implement something better, like an immigration reform? I think we have seen these for years being the problem, that for decades now, we haven't had an integral reform that actually converts this system into a modern immigration system. I'm going to start with Cecilia.
Sure, thank you. And I think you're right that there is this, of course, ongoing need, decades that we've had for comprehensive bipartisan immigration reform, and that has ultimately failed to come to fruition in Congress. But I think that what the Biden administration has done they have had made a lot of progress in the past 4 years on certain types of legal immigration. They have rebounded from a system that they inherited from the previous Trump administration and from the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think that I can share that in the first half of fiscal year 2024, the Department of State issued more non-immigrant visas than ever before in any previous year during the same period. So they not only rebounded from the system that they inherited with plenty of backlogs and delays and inefficiencies in every part of the system, but they also came back from it and went further. They also had progress in the legal immigration space. We're talking about the H-1B modernization rule, the fee increases that are helping to meet new processing needs. And also there was the AI executive order that came out that included some immigration language. And while some of that hasn't exactly come to fruition yet, some of it has promising inclusions that could be brought forward again if they are to obtain a second term. For instance, Schedule A is a list of shortage occupations that also has not been updated in 30 years. And it is, supposed to be responsive and help our immigration system be responsive to the labor market needs of our current situation. However, without being responsive to those needs, can't do that. And the AI executive order brought this topic up for the first time in years. And so, the Department of Labor was offered the opportunity to the public to respond to this. And so while I don't expect that they will make any changes to that during this term, if the Biden administration is able to secure a second term, I think that is something that they could do. So I think there are things that they could do, and there are things that they have done, and there's a lot of efficiencies that they have put into place to be able to bounce back from the system that they inherited from the previous administration.
Thank you, David. What do you expect from a second Biden administration? Or what would you like to see?
I mean, a second term for President Biden would be a great opportunity for them to make some bold changes to the immigration process. I think you would likely see more executive action than you've seen in the first term, where he's very concerned about re-election. I wouldn't expect a major change in border policy to be part of that, except in terms of more legal processing at ports of entry, or more use of parole to let people in legally. But I think the asylum ban is here to stay. I think they made it pretty clear in the rule that they put out that that's their goal is. I mean, their goal of reducing the number of encounters by 2/3 is so dramatic and so extreme. They're so far from that goal. I really don't expect any major changes there. But I do think that we should expect them to continue to make progress on the legal immigration side, more opportunities for children of temporary visa holders, primarily from India, who are aging out. They've sort of been deprioritized. They've been minor changes there, but I think as time goes on, there's going to be more opportunity to address some of these long festering issues within our immigration system that has support. I mean, there's no one who's like, the children of temporary visa holders who've grown up here since the age of 5, we should really get them out of the country. It's just one of these issues that the administration hasn't had the time to get around to yet. It's sort of on the back burner, and hopefully in a second term, they would get around to it. I expect to continue to see an emphasis on parole sponsorship programs currently available in just 4 countries. There's a big backlog in those countries. I expect to see more of that potentially expanded to other countries going forward, because it has been helpful in managing migration. And so far, they've withstood court challenges. And that was one of the major reasons for them not going further than what they did. And so now that it's gotten over the district court level, now the Fifth Circuit is going to be taking a look at it. If they get past that hurdle, then it really does open the door for them to do other things similar to that would allow a lot more people to immigrate lawfully. The prospect for executive action is still out there for spouses of U.S. citizens. I think that's going to be a test case as well, certainly subject to lawsuits by the attorneys general of Republican states. So you're going to have that potentially before the election, see how that plays out. And that would be sort of can this survive? If it can, then we'll potentially be able to do it for other categories. So I do think there's a lot to be hopeful for a second term with the Biden administration on immigration. But I don't expect a major reversal on its border processing policies.
Thank you, David. Zach?
Yeah, I mean, I think I largely agree across the board. I think, hope springs eternal, and I think, we'll see after this election cycle, right, about how Democrats and Republicans do in the election cycle. And I do think because Republicans have made this such a central part of their campaign, I think if they do not deliver at the ballot box, I think there is a real opening that says this isn't a political winner, and it isn't where the majority of the people at, of which many, many polls have shown to be the case. So we would hope that there is an opening to think about, addressing the long-standing concerns, both with managing flows of forced global migration, which I think there are plenty of things to do on that front. And also thinking about solving some of the challenges with the long settled parts of our community that are unable to adjust status. And I think there's very few people that are going to say there isn't a problem with our immigration system. It's woefully out of date. I think we continue to press that forward. I think there are things that the administration can and should do to continue to provide protections and pathways to status for more people, not only just for immigrants, but for the well-being of working families in America and the benefits that accrue from a legal immigration system where people have access to pathways to legal entry. I think what the specifics looks like, I think there is hope that we're going to see more of from the administration, but before the election day rolls around, as they continue to try to solve those challenges. And I think we're going to continue to push for reforms to the system to make it a functioning system in the 21st century that is to the best benefit of the American people. And I think there is potential for that, but that's not going to be easy. And the specifics of that, right, I think will be determined a bit about what is politically possible. And unfortunately, because I think if we start winning on the politics, we'll start winning on better policy as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia, David, and Zach for being with us. And thank you to all my colleagues who were here and had great questions. Have a good weekend, everyone. Good to see you all.